Hello, and welcome to Health and Fitness Redefined. I'm your host, Anthony Amen. Join me today as we take a dive into the world of health and fitness, where we learn how to overcome adversity, to pick fact versus fiction, and see health and fitness in a whole new light. You guys, with your reviews and reaching out all the time, we have learned that specific topics with multiple guests have been the most successful, contributed all to the episode we did on the keto diet, which came out at this point about 2 years ago, and is still getting hundreds of views a day. So definitely something worth checking out if you have not. I put two people up against each other. Is keto good? Is keto bad? And it really just drives their points home. So I said, let's do it again. This time, we're going to go a little more into the U.S., the Department of Agriculture, talking about different types of guidelines and stuff that's going on, what are the recommendations are for food and stuff. And it's exciting because things change all the time in this field. And as you guys know, I'm a big component of learn. That's what it's all about. So without further ado, let's welcome two guests to today's show. First, Colette, then Kristin. Welcome. It's a pleasure to have you ladies on today.
Great to be here. Thank you, Anthony.
Thank you.
Colette, we've had you on before. So just introduce yourself really quickly, and then we'll get on to Kristin.
Sure. I'm VP of Nutrition and Education at Simply Good Foods. We have two brands that we work with, which is Atkins and Quest, bars and shakes, mostly snack foods. I'm also a New York Times bestseller, wrote a book on the Atkins diet and how to do a well-constructed low-carbohydrate diet and how to make it sustainable. Because keto is hard to sustain for years and years unless you're highly motivated and you're reversing a disease process. But there's ways to make it the most healthy, find your own carbohydrate tolerance, and find the carbohydrate level that keeps you healthy. So that's what I like to talk about. I also have a master's degree in nutrition.
And we've done a couple of episodes today, so I highly recommend you guys go check that out. And then Kristin, tell us a little bit about yourself. You're new here.
Yep, I'm new here. I'm the newbie. So my name's Kristin Kirkpatrick. I'm a registered dietitian. I've been at the Cleveland Clinic for 20 years in integrative and lifestyle medicine. I also write for the Today Show. I've got two books. One is going to be out late fall, and the first one was published a few years ago, a bestseller on non-alcoholic fatty liver disease and some of the lifestyle components to that as well. I got into this field because I was an adolescent that was obese, insulin resistant. I went to go see a dietitian. I didn't even know what that was at the time. And I got all the wrong information. And of course, at the time, I didn't realize it was wrong. But it really kind of put me down this path of trying to be real with patients and trying to give people guidance that made sense within their lifestyle, which didn't happen with me. So I wanted people to have a chance to do it right the first time. And that's why I got into this profession.
Yeah, and I think we can, all three of us can agree really simply, probably the only thing we'll agree about all night, but it's okay, which is things need to change with where recommendations are, guidelines are, and everything out there. A good example, which I think is a good base point for us, is to let's go all the way back to the 70s. And it's a topic I talk about a lot, where one of the biggest guidelines were sugar is good for you. It doesn't cause any harm. You can have as much as you want, and we, the government, say so. So that in and of itself was happening in the 1970s, and people would go, hey, why would they recommend something that we know that's bad for you? Well, reason being that study they did was sponsored by Coca-Cola. So Coca-Cola obviously doesn't want you to think that sugar in high quantities is bad for you. So they pushed out, no, it's fats. And then you guys probably remember just as much as I do, coming out of that no fat diet. Like everything has to be low fat, no the blah, blah, blah. And then it caused a whole bunch of colorectal issues. So there's things that were just kind of left in the dark until all of a sudden, then from there it went to the got milk. I know you guys remember the got milk commercials. Mm-hmm. They're pretty funny, but it was drink more milk. And then 10 years later, it disappeared. And now we're just on no sugar, stay away from sugar. Sugar's the devil, all kind of different stuff. And it's just all over the place. So, Colette, I want to start with you. Where do you think we should be now? What do you think the main issue with recommendations are now?
Well, you have to look at the plethora of research that's come out over the last 2 decades and what the trends are, and not rely so much on epidemiology studies, but more clinical trials. What diet were they on? What were the outcomes of being on that diet? How long they were on that diet? The food guide pyramid right now is giving the same advice for the last 20 or 30 years. It's recommending a macronutrient consumption of 200 to 300 grams of carbohydrate a day. They would like you to choose the most healthiest carbs, but that's sometimes just too much for individuals that are carbohydrate intolerant. They want you to have fat less than 30 grams, 30% of total calories, and protein less than 20% of calories. So it's a carbohydrate heavy approach. If you're lean and mean and healthy and you can tolerate that many carbohydrates because you burn it off, it's fine if you follow the diet the way they describe it as the healthiest of carbohydrates, when you choose the healthiest types of carbohydrates, the highest in fiber. However, 52% of the population is pre-diabetic or diabetic, 70% of the population is overweight or obese. And when you look at the history, it could be a result of overconsumption of refined carbohydrates in the form of sugars and white flours and denatured carbohydrates, and being less active and being able to burn that off. And when you're at that point of being insulin resistant, pre-diabetic or diabetic, you're carbohydrate intolerant. Everybody accepts lactose intolerance or gluten intolerance, but for some reason we haven't been able to grasp, according to the evolving science over the last 20 years, a large proportion of the population is carbohydrate intolerant. They simply do not digest and use carbohydrates the way the body is supposed to use. They consume more than their body can handle. They use a lot of that and store it as fat. And then you're taking in too many carbohydrates when your triglycerides are too high and your HDL is too low. That's a clear indication. Another indication is when you have most of your weight around the middle. That's a sign of insulin resistance. So the food guide pyramid has not caught up with the research. They do not pull that type of research up because they eliminated all weight loss studies in the last rendition. Hopefully, because we've lobbied and asked them, you have to include these studies to address an obesity and overweight epidemic in the United States. So hopefully they'll grab those studies this time, but we'll see. They constantly try to continue with the status quo, and that's unfortunate because they're not dealing with the majority of the population that needs more specific recommendations.
Yeah, and it's interesting. I believe we went from the pyramid to the MyPlate, if I remember correctly. That's kind of where we're sitting now. So, Kristin, I'm going to talk to you specifically about that. What is the MyPlate recommendations currently, and what do they currently recommend for the population, specifically to the new guidelines that I believe they came out like 2-3 years ago?
The MyPlate recommendations, they're very in line with the dietary guidelines. So they're looking at a variety of fruits and vegetables, which I like, a variety of color. I always talk about color with my patients. Again, that's more of a real life perspective of how you communicate. If you look at the actual plate, the majority of it is going to be those fruits and vegetables. They're also looking at that whole grain component. So again, to Colette's point, that might not be something that would be really representative of absolutely everyone. Definitely not all of my patients, especially those with type 2 diabetes or NAFLD. So that's the other component. And then the consumption of the lean protein. So it's very similar to what we saw in the food guide pyramid, but it's just, the proportions are just depicted in a different manner. I also like that they have physical activity kind of off to the side. That's another thing that I love. But to Colette's point, it doesn't really get to the personalization, which is what I see lacking in a lot of the guidelines that we have. Ultimately, as a dietitian, when I have a patient come into my office, I'm probably not going to go to the guidelines. They could be appropriate for some populations, but for me, I'm going to do a deep dive, especially when you're looking at integrative medicine. This is what we do, into who the patient is, what's their environment, what are their cultural and personal preferences. I realize the dietary guidelines touch on that, but very briefly. And then the other thing is that I would say is that there was a study that was done in November showing that only 1 in 4 individuals accurately assess the healthiness of their diet. So I think that sometimes we assume when we tell someone have a nutrient dense diet that that's just kind of understood, right? Like, oh yeah, of course, I'm going to have a nutrient dense diet. But I'll tell you, of the thousands of patients that I saw, it's very subjective. What nutrient density means to one person is different for another. So, if we go back to that my plate approach, it's not something I use. It's not something that I'm criticizing. That's not why I don't use it, but it's not personalized enough for me. It's very similar to the dietary guidelines, and it's going to have things that I'm going to recommend as well, but we have to get a step further from it.
I'm going to ask you both a really hard question just right off the bat. So I know none of us here really have any say over guidelines of being able to correct them, but hopefully this gets the word out at least. And this is a simple yes or no. Do you believe that the U.S. government or any government institution at all should even have nutrition guidelines? Just yes or no, Colette?
It depends on who's running that particular arm of the government and how they're influenced. It can be political and it can be influenced by, as you said, the Coke industry or sugar industry or farmers there's just too many influences in the government right now for them to be objective and give a personalized approach. In fact, 2 years ago, the Appropriations Committee agreed that the dietary guidelines needed an independent scientific arm of the government to review how they do it. And they came up with several recommendations and demonstrated where the weaknesses were and how they come up with their recommendations. And I thought that was a step in the right direction because a lot of what they recommended was more along the lines of personalized precision nutrition advice. They didn't follow any of it. So at this point, I think it could be a fool's errand because they just keep on doing the same thing over and over again, and they don't have the proper funding to do it right. I think an independent arm of the government might do a better job, like the National Institutes of Science and Medicine. But that I doubt whether or not that change is going to happen in my lifetime.
A bigger answer, but I do appreciate it.
Yeah.
And then Kristin, same question to you.
I'm pretty similar with Colette in that the answer I think is yes. I think that it's necessary for things like school lunch program, for WIC, for SNAP. We need these guidelines set in place, but I do think an independent agency, maybe even working with the federal government, is going to be necessary to make them really be as efficient as they can be and effective as they can be. But my general answer is yes, that we do still need guidelines for some of these government run programs. We just need to look at who's providing the guidelines and are we actually implementing the guidelines that are suggested to us.
All right, so you're both pretty much on the same page. It just depends on who's running that separate program and who's doing it. And I'm sure all of us can agree that having an outside politically influenced party to push an agenda just because they want to show, let's say, Coke pushing for sugar needs to be pushed out because the health of our society in and of itself is more important than somebody making extra money in their pocket. I mean, a fact that I know some of my audience knows and you guys, but I think I haven't talked about it in a while, so it's worth mentioning, the cost of obesity. So and I'm going to talk about more specifically not the cost to what we all think of our own health, but the cost, actually financial strain of obesity is over $5 billion a year. I want people to think about that for a second. $5 billion through healthcare costs, through fuel costs, through tons of different avenues. Like our lifespan is getting shorter. So, Kristin, I'm going to go start with you on this one. What do you think needs to be done first? What's the very first approach to help fix the biggest issue in my eyes, which is our average age of living is at a decline for the first time ever in human history. So if you were to enact one specific thing, what would that be to help stop that?
Well, and let me just add to this too, just talking about that longevity aspect. We see a huge increase also of outliving our brain. So even if we are living longer, most of us are outliving our brain. Our brain is going before the body. So even if we're living longer from that longevity aspect, we're not living well. Right. So I want my people to live longer and well. I go to the blue zones approach on this one. If I were to look at what would be the one thing that would create better mental health, better physical health, help us live longer and better, I'm really going to go towards the perspective of keeping things a little bit more simple and not looking at a very specific approach as a one size fits all. So again, I know that's kind of not as specific as you want in terms of the answer, but I think finding that personalization, and if we look at the blue zones, they're not really going on to social media. They have a sense of purpose. They're sleeping well. Their stress management is well. It's hard to answer that in one swoop because we have so many things that impact longevity. You could say fasting could be the key to longevity if that's something that we did. But I think we need to simplify things a little bit more. That would be my general answer. And of course, I'd have to go into a lot of detail to discuss what that actually means.
So, Colette, before we move the answer onto you, let me just give you a little background into the question, right? So you're a government entity. You're not responsible for what we all see, which is more of that one-on-one approach, right? Someone comes into us and personalizing each for individuals. You have to give a general sweeping to 100 million people. So in order to get a message across to over hundreds of millions of people as far as one specific thing, trying to personalize it becomes nearly impossible because no one has time to do that. So it needs to be more of a specific approach to where if you think the government should have a say, even as an independent entity doing it, as far as this is the guidelines we need to follow, that it can't be an individually based purpose because it's too big of a population. So the question really is what can they do as that government entity to help the millions of people that have to follow them now in order to have everyone live healthier, longer lives?
Unfortunately, there's no simple answer. It's impossible, as you said. It so much depends on the individual. So I would prefer the government talk in dietary patterns rather than individual nutrients, like, demonizing eggs originally and now they're healthy, demonizing sodium, demonizing sugar, demonizing fat. It would be better if you talked about dietary patterns for how you approach food. So everyone knows you need protein, whether it's vegetarian or animal-based. Protein is one of those topics that is generalized that can meet the masses because the body, in order to survive, has a requirement of protein. Generalized talk about fat because there's healthy fats and there's unhealthy fats, and just talking about which are the best choices of fat. And carbohydrates in the form of high fiber carbohydrates. So if those three principles were followed, high fiber carbohydrates, healthy fats, adequate protein, that would be a simplified message that would reach the masses without getting, so this diet is for you, that diet, more individualized for which is impossible for a government to do. So talking more about dietary patterns, talking more about macronutrients and their balance, and which are the good and bad of that particular category for a generalized educational approach. I think education is powerful, and when it's done properly, it can make a profound difference in people's lives.
So I'm going to follow up with that real quick. So as a good example and kind of approach, another avenue to think about is instead of having guidelines set in place for the individuals, what about guidelines set in place for the companies that are actually producing the foods, which is another avenue they take. And a good example into this is I just took some of my clients out to the grocery store, right? And I do what I call a grocery store tour. I walk around and I teach people how to shop. I want to show them how to read a label. I want to show them what to look for while they're shopping and kind of certain aisles to avoid while at grocery stores. Because once you learn, it's pretty easy. I'm in and out in like 10 minutes of what I need to grab. And I'm going to pick one specific topic because I think it's easier just to talk about one thing than it is to talk about hundreds of different items. And that topic is hydrogenated oils. So trans fats, as everyone knows, have been banned and try to be banned over the last 10 years. And it keeps getting pushed back, because the companies need more time in order to take it out of their products. And those not watching audio, it's in huge quotation marks. So why? And then what is that company? So let's start with what companies are the ones advocating to keep it. This is what blows everyone's mind. The number one company that's paying to keep hydrogenated oils and products is the peanut butter companies. People get blown away by that. You guys aren't shocked. You knew that. So you look at Jif, you look at Skippy, you're reading the back of a label. It shows trans fat. It says 0 grams, Anthony. It says it. Yeah. But did you know, as long as the serving size is under 0.5, you could put 0. You can put 0. It's 0.4 grams, but you can put 0. You got to learn to read a label and say, oh my gosh, there it is on the label. And so many people are like, first of all, that size like 3 font. And second of all, they have no idea what it is. So to be more specific and to kind of get a question right back at you, Colette, and then we'll go to Kristin, is what do you think the answer is? If you think the answer is to start there, just say, come on, get your act together. Let's just ban these certain types of things we know that are horrible for you. Or are we still keeping to the approach of giving information to the masses? What's the first avenue we should go after, and what do you think the solution is?
Well, they have come a long way. The FDA has regulations about trans fats. And the reason why it has to be 0.5 grams or less is because sometimes there's naturally occurring trans fats. So I usually tell people to read the ingredients. If you see hydrogenated or partially hydrogenated oil, even if it says 0, put it down. But if it says 0 and there's no hydrogenated oils in the ingredient list, you're pretty safe, because those are more likely naturally occurring trans fats, and peanut butter is notorious for that. Because of the processing method that it takes to make peanut butter, it's bound to, with the heat processing, it's bound to make it safe, which is necessary, by the way. It's bound to have some trans fats in it. So you have to get more specific on that topic and teach patients to just read the ingredients list and steer clear of hydrogenated oils. And recently, you won't find a whole lot of added hydrogenated oils to products, because the food companies have stepped up to the plate and taken it out of the food process.
Yeah, and then Kristin, same question to you.
Yeah, I think as long as we continue to have consumers providing pressure on companies, we'll continue to have companies wanting to do the right thing. So, and we do see that. I wrote an article a few years ago, Anthony, on what my dream grocery store was. When you were talking about your grocery store tour, I started thinking about this. And I said that my dream grocery store tour was like, my dream grocery store was like the most boring grocery store you could ever imagine, because you would walk in and all you would see on every single aisle, and everything would be at eye level, would be the ingredient list. And then the numbers would be kind of next to that. But you wouldn't see the front of package claims and things like that sometimes can sway people into buying something. I agree with Colette that the ingredient list is going to be the most important. I think and we can't do this at the grocery store, but as an added educational piece, when you were talking about education, I was thinking about something we did with the Cleveland Food Bank. So I was on the board of the Cleveland Food Bank and involved in this process with kids who would go home on the weekends. They couldn't get school lunch because it was the weekend, and we would give them backpacks with food in it. Now, the food was nutrient dense food, but the thing that really made it stick, the thing that was so critical to this, was we said how to use all the food. Like, here's how you take a bag of beans and here's how you create a meal out of it. Here's how you do this. So I think it's kind of two-faced here in that we have to get we got to get the right foods in the grocery store, yes, but we also have to get the right education. We can't assume that people know what to do with fresh food. We've seen that, and we've done studies at Cleveland Clinic where we've seen that as well, that can be a challenge. So I think, for the grocery store component, yes, companies are really stepping up to the plate. I'm seeing it, but not every company is doing that. And sometimes it's hard for the consumer to determine, okay, this is a really good, responsible company that's very evidence-based versus another company.
I think the simple answer to all of this is the companies that refuse to do the change, their target audience is generally kids. Because in their eyes, the kids don't know. And of course they don't know. They're young. And mommy, daddy, I want this. Mommy, daddy, get that for me. Then they throw a hissy fit. And if you've ever had a 2 or 3-year-old in a grocery store throwing a hissy fit, usually you just throw it in your shopping cart because you want them to stop screaming because they're just creating a ruckus. Everyone is relating instantly to that scenario. So do you think that the targeting of kids is something that should be changed, or do you think I'm just hitting a mood point here? And Chris, I'm going to start with you, then go to Colette.
Well, I've got a 10-year-old and a 7-year-old. So, man, you're speaking to me when I hear this and I hear about the grocery store. Yeah, I don't think the targeting of kids is going to stop, but I think the most important aspect, and again, we've seen this in studies, in order to educate kids, is the family aspect. How are mom and dad eating, and what are some of the examples they're providing? I also think sometimes, I went to a birthday party the other day for my 7-year-old, and I brought like chocolate chip cookies, and someone's like, I can't believe you brought those chocolate chip cookies because you're a registered dietitian. And I was like, well, did you think I was going to bring like a bowl of cucumbers? Like, this is like, so we still need to, like, again, this is the real life approach. Like, it's okay for a kid to have a chocolate chip cookie every once in a while. I would argue that if you make it yourself, it's going to be a much better quality. But the point here is that it's got to start at the family. There is an awesome handout by the Institute for Functional Medicine that is basically the phytonutrient spectrum, and it's all these colors. And so when I've taken my kids to the store, sometimes, like, I will give my kids this handout and I'll say, you guys can pick out 5 colors. Okay, I'm going to involve you in the process. And of course, we're not talking about Fruit Loops or tricks, right? Pick out 5 colors and in the produce section or some other section. And then when we get home, you're going to tell me how we're going to utilize those colors, right? And that's one way to involve them. So I think, like, yes, we're getting marketing thrown at kids, but we have to involve kids in the decision-making, even if they're 7, of what food we're going to put in the house as a family. How are we going to cook together? Involving kids, again, the studies show that makes them healthier. And then, what am I eating? What is the example that I'm providing? That is so much more powerful than something that, it's just going to say they're going to see on a commercial, but that's not accurate now with today's kids. They're going to see it on YouTube, right? Like some advertisement on YouTube. I saw commercials like in the middle of He-Man and She-Ra. That's not happening anymore. They're like watching YouTube. So, I think that's a really interesting perspective to look at, that the family matters a lot more than the marketing, but we got to step up to the plate as parents to actually engage with our kids in that manner.
Before we get to it, I just need to mention 2 big things that literally just stood out brilliantly to me. Because you guys coming from the nutrition side, I'm coming from the fitness side, right? So the first thing, as you mentioned, is setting an example for kids. And this goes 2 ways. I can't tell you how many times I see parents trying to get the kids signed up for personal training, and they're like 7, 8, 9 years old, which is great, but the parents themselves don't work out.
Yeah.
And then I'm just like, your kids, why your kid doesn't want to come is because you're not doing it with them.
Mm-hmm.
And then you see the flip side when it comes to food. You see the parents say, I have to buy this for my kid, so it has to be in my house. Well, why are you feeding your kid horrible food 24/7? Like, don't you want your kids to learn healthier habits? So, yeah, you're not going to eat it, so why would you give it to your kid? Like, why not just take it out of the household? But then the third point you mentioned, which is also brilliant, and I actually had a conversation with a new staff member just hired yesterday about this. She was telling me, it's like, Anthony, what do you talk about on the floor? We have a half an hour with these people, and we're not going to sit there and just count the whole time. We're going to have conversations. I specifically said, I want you to talk about the bad foods and things you eat. And she's like, what? I was like, because people think we're perfect. And I don't want people to fall and say, oh, you're perfect. I'm never going to look like you because you do A, B, C, D, E. No, I'm not perfect. And I personally love my IPAs. I drink a couple a week. They're amazing. But my point being is, I'm human. Like you said, I want to come bring chocolate chip cookies to your house. I'm going to eat cookies once in a while. It's going to happen. So there's a way to balance everything you're doing.
Right.
And it's showing people it's not extremes. It's just smaller changes that need to be done to get bigger results. So Colette, I know that was a big jump in for you, but I want you to just kind of add anything onto that and then we'll move on.
And you have to be careful about counterculture, because there was this whole thing on the millennial YouTube and TikTok about almond moms and how much they hate almond moms because there was one
What's an
mother
almond mom? I'm
an
sorry.
almond mom, and there was a mother, the famous, one of the housewives that had a daughter who was a model, and she was hungry, so she handed her a bowl of almonds. She said, "Here, have a few almonds instead of grabbing something sugary." And I thought, well, that's great. It's setting an example. It's showing her how to eat. She's doing it herself, all the things we just talked about. But then you had these young millennials online saying, "I had an almond mom," and she set me up for eating disorders and all of these little TikTok videos about how moms created an eating disorder for them. And I got so mad. It's like, wait, I was an almond mom. But what is wrong with demonstrating to your child a better choice of food, a more healthier choice of food, and setting an example for them and teaching them how to eat right? And there's the pendulum always swings, and there's always that risk of a counterculture type thing going on. So balance is the perfect answer to any of that. Every once in a while, don't forbid sugar in your house, but just control it and have them balance it, and then you won't wind up with a almond mom video on TikTok from the 17-year-old.
Yeah, I just don't TikTok. So
Right.
there's the example for that. But guys, we're going to take a quick break from a word from our sponsor, and we'll be right back. On the flip side, we have a little more of specific topics to dive into, which I'm very excited about. And I just want to point out, just props to both of you guys here. We don't pre-question anything ever. So the fact you guys are answering these questions brilliant is awesome. So we'll be right back. For us, we know what it's like to feel unhealthy, depressed, and downright defeated. We want to show others there is a right way, and through fitness, you could do anything you set your mind to. Fitness can give you that motivation, confidence, energy you need to bridge that mental gap and prevent you from missing important life events. We understand it's about feeling better, living longer, and being good examples for our kids. We understand this because we live it. And for us, that's the redefined difference. Hey everybody, and welcome back to the second half. We have Kristin and Colette here. We are talking about different types of guidelines, what needs to change, what doesn't work, and almond moms apparently. So we learn something new every day. But I think the best place to kind of start now is to come up with those specific recommendations and guidelines that we personally believe should be pushed. And I'm going to start with the pain point just right off the bat because I like the hard questions first. And both of you are going to totally disagree with me. It's going to be fun. A lot of the times I see in my field is protein. I think that's the least talked about macronutrient is protein. And in our eyes, when we're setting people up on, I don't want to say diets, but it's healthier habits because we want to make things easy. We want to keep life easy. The first thing we track is your protein intake, and that's literally it. We start protein. And 99% of people, especially women, do not eat enough protein when they're doing any kind of strength training program. The current guidelines to eating enough protein, in my personal opinion, are way too low. They're somewhere between 0.4 to 0.6 grams per pound. So you take what you weigh and times that out by that, and that's how much protein you should take. Personally, I believe for women, it should be between 0.8 and 1, and men between 1 and 1.2. And that's per lean muscle mass. So that's kind of where I'm at. You need enough protein because protein is going to help you build muscle. Having more muscle in your body is going to increase your metabolic rate and overall get you going, started in the right direction. So, Kristin, I'm going to start with you. What do you think of this, and what do you think the solution to this problem is, and what are your recommendations of protein?
Yeah. So for protein, it's interesting that you were giving the numbers, and I mean, I kind of had a little bit of like PTSD because I went back into my dietetic intern days where I had like my little notebook and I had to calculate, and it was based on so many different things, your age and are you on hemodialysis? I mean, we could go on and on. It would probably be really boring. But when I thought about the numbers, and then I think about numbers that are given in the dietary guidelines, right? So, like, have less than 10% of your calories come from this. Most of my patients, I can tell you anecdotally, don't know how to take a number and translate it into an actual dietary pattern. So, some of the recommendations I make, I really like protein. I like moderate to higher protein approaches because of the fact that it's more satiating, you feel more full, you're not hungry, and the way I structure it, instead of a number, even though I'll do the calculation with the patient in my head, so I'll have an idea, is really if you can get some sort of protein, small or large, in every meal and snack, you're probably going to get to the point where I want you to be towards the end of the day, and you're going to put something in that is going to keep you satiated. So again, protein at lunch could be something as large as, let's say, a piece of wild salmon, and then it could be as small as look at just a sprinkle of hemp seeds in, let's say oatmeal in the morning. But the point is, if you can kind of look at where are the protein sources that I want to focus on and then get them in throughout the day, that tends to be really beneficial for my patients. And my patients, for the most part, are 40 years plus, usually female. So for my patient base who I'm seeing, that works really well. That gets them to adequate protein. For my patients over the age of 70, typically I'm going to double it. So I'm really going to get more into, let's look at where we can supplement protein, because protein is going to be really critical later in life for a lot of different reasons that you're already aware of, Anthony. So that's kind of where my guidelines are.
Love it. And Colette?
Yeah, the guidelines depend on your age, your activity level, whether you're a female or a male, and how much you're working out. Because people think if they eat protein, they're going to build muscle. That's just not going to happen. You have to be lifting weights, and then when you are, depending on the severity of your lifting weights, will depend on your protein requirements. So there's a minimal, and then there's a maximal. That's how I look at it. And again, Kristin was right. People can't convert those numbers. If you tell them so many, ounces of protein per kilogram of weight, forget it. That's the worst advice. People don't understand it. So I usually, in my books, tell them 4 to 6 ounces of cooked protein per meal, spread it out during the day. And what that looks like, the palm of your hand is a 4 ounce to 6 ounce serving of cooked meat. And by the end of the day, they usually meet their protein requirements, because if they don't meet the protein requirements, they will lose, the body will get it. It's one of those essential nutrients. If you don't take it in your food, you will take it from your body and eat muscle. So you don't want to lose lean tissue, especially as you age. So you need that essential nutrient. And then the best way to do that is to explain it. And what does that look like? How much does it weigh? And how do you reach it by the end of the day? Because you don't want somebody to eat a 20-ounce steak in one sitting either.
Yeah, and that's why I like talking about these topics, because it gives different perspectives of everything. And the only other thing I'm going to add to protein is, if you are vegan, vegetarian, please be careful of tracking protein when it comes through plant sources, because plants aren't a complete protein. Right. You have to look at specific combos that add together, because you need your essential amino acids to build the complete protein. A good example, like we talked about, rice and beans work perfectly hand in hand together. Those form a great complete protein. So I don't want to dive.
The good news about protein is, in all consumer research that I've seen, consumers are looking for protein. I mean, so you'll see the front of package call out how many grams of protein are in the particular serving of packaged food. So that's a good sign that the consumers are catching on and how important protein is.
Awesome. Love that. And now let's get to more harder ones. So the next topic, before we get to the most controversial, let's start with fat. Fat is obviously another macronutrient that people need. Fat, for those that do not know, is the most calorically dense per gram. As an example, just for consumers listening today, your fats are 9 calories per gram as opposed to your protein and carbs, which are 4. So you're looking at almost double per gram. So something to keep in mind. I believe personally fats obviously back 15, 20 years ago were totally miscategorized and totally thrown under the bus and run over by 10 cars. But we started bringing it back in our days. And I feel like we went the opposite extreme where now Atkins and keto, everything's low carb, high fat kind of specific diets. I believe my people kind of know where I lie, but I want to get your guys' opinion. Colette, I know we talked about this a little previously in the last show we did. So what's your opinion, short and sweet answer on fats, and what do you think more specifically guidelines should be where we're keeping it simple for people to follow?
Well, again, that depends on the dietary pattern. When you're on a very low carbohydrate ketogenic diet, you're pulling out a lot of the carbohydrates and you're depending where you're going to get your calorie requirements from. So you're replacing fat with from when you're losing carbohydrates. So fat in that setting is really important, up to 60% of calories. And then it's the healthiest choices that are the best, the olive oils, the avocados, the nuts, the seeds. And then there's the matter of choice of fats that are best. But you have to rely on fat because if you don't, you're not going to meet your calorie requirements and you're not feeding the metabolism when it's running on. When you're on a ketogenic diet, you're running on a fat metabolism. You have to give it the fuel in order to function properly. So fat is the most important on a low carbohydrate diet. But now as you begin to add, protein remains constant. So protein is going to be that 25 to 30% of calories. But as you increase carbs, when you're getting carbs back into your diet, like fruits and vegetables and some whole grains in controlled portions, then you have to cut back on your fat because now you're not burning it all for fuel. Because when you're on a ketogenic diet, that's what you're burning. You're running on a fat metabolism. You need that macronutrient. But the higher the carbohydrate, that's when you need to seesaw the balance of fat and start bringing it down. And still, the advice is the same on which are the healthiest choices of fats.
Awesome. Thank you. And Kristin?
Yeah, I think when I think about when I heard your question here, it's really going back to some of the studies and programs that we've done and the sustainability of them. When I have looked at more low fat approaches, which we've done in patients that are very high risk for cardiac outcomes, they do very well short term, but it's hard for them sometimes to stick with it long term. And I tend to see these patients coming back into my office, let's say 2 or 3 years. I actually just got a message last night from someone who did one of our low fat programs and said, I'm really struggling. I've put on this much weight, etc. So I think from a sustainability standpoint, when I'm looking at my patient base and someone says, oh my gosh, Kristin, I lost 20 pounds. Am I one of your success stories now? I'm so happy for you. You are my success story in 5 years. So either come back to me in 5 years and let's see what you're doing. Or let's kind of revamp. So I think that fat has a very strong place in the diet. Globally, we've seen benefits. We have all this discussion about superfoods, kale is the best superfood or seaweed. We have all these opinions. I think extra virgin olive oil is probably the best superfood out there. I mean, there are so many benefits. For me, I don't get to the perspective with patients where I'm saying, well, you have to absolutely have fat in every single solitary meal. But I think that to Colette's point, if we look at the guidelines, we need to be more specific of the type of fats. We can't be, just kind of more high level and say, well, limit your saturated fats and have more unsaturated fats. Again, that assumes that someone understands what that actually is. And then someone could be just veering towards just general vegetable oils, which might not be a great option either. So I think from a sustainability standpoint, when you have more moderate fat in your diet, you tend to be able to sustain that a little bit longer.
And before we get to the last macronutrient, which both of you know what it is, I want to mention a point, and I want to go back to what we spoke about 25 minutes ago. And this is pretty much the answer to this first question I asked you guys, which do you think there should be government regulations on this? Every topic we have talked about, every answer you guys have given has been, it depends.
So boring, right? I know.
No, but my point being, it depends on the individual. It depends on underlying conditions. It depends on the age. It depends on their sex. There's so many underlying conditions that play a role in what kind of guidelines somebody should follow, that going back to my point, how do you set guidelines for hundreds of millions of people? Therefore, it basically becomes impossible. And I think that's what we're kind of getting to, is like a wraparound question is, it depends. So before we get into carbohydrates, I think it's important to understand that what is that answer to hundreds of millions of people? Like, how do you specifically teach them in simple terms? Because so many people, once we get complicated to complex carbs and simple carbs, like, you lose them. You see their brain just like, nope, I'm out of this conversation. I'm done. Yeah. Take this protein, like we were talking about, timesing 0.8 times their body weight. No, I'm not doing math, man. It's not happening. Like, so it becomes difficult. With carbohydrates, we all know carbohydrates are fuel, right? Carbohydrates are what convert to ATP, and our body uses them as energy. It's the only thing before ketosis that will actually give us energy and actually cross that blood-brain barrier. So we do need carbohydrates. And I think the answer, or the question first, and we'll start with Kristin, is what's the solution for hundreds of millions of people for the answer on carbohydrates?
So I like to talk in analogies, simple ways to communicate to people. So what I say to a lot of my patients is to really avoid having any carbohydrate that doesn't have fiber attached to it. And where I go to that is my concept of what I call, I've talked about this a lot when I'm presenting that kind of thing. I talk about this concept of competition for digestion. And I go back to this same example, which again, as an obese kid who got the wrong information, I tend to go back to the demons of things that I ate when I was younger, and that is Twizzlers. So I tell people, when you go to a movie theater, you get a king size Twizzler. First of all, you crave it. There's a whole cycle of it, right? So you crave it. You're thinking about it. I'm sitting in the movie. I'm like, it's time to get the Twizzlers. I go get the Twizzlers. I eat the Twizzlers. I feel awesome right after I have it, right? And that's because of all the things that are going on in my brain, neurotransmitters, my blood sugar's high, like life is good. And then it's not, right? So my blood sugar drops, the whole thing. And then I need more of it, right? So that's that cycle, right? It went lower. If you look at Walt Willett's work, he shows very clearly an easy to digest carbohydrate goes much lower in your blood sugar when it goes down to your low. And then you're like, shoot, I got to get more of the Twizzlers. And then after the movie's done and I've consumed 3,000 calories of Twizzlers, I'm like, let's go out to dinner, right? So that's Twizzler. That's example number one. Now let's say I had something that I get is not the same example, but let's say I have an apple. So the apple has insoluble and soluble fiber, both in the peel and in the meats. And the meat being, the fruit inside. And so I take a bite of that apple and my body initially has the same reaction of, this is amazing. I love this. I love this sugar. This is my preferred fuel, but I got to do something else here. There's something else here that I have to try and break down. So because fiber is not digestible, I've now created competition for digestion. And instead of having that huge roller coaster, now I have peaks and valleys. So if I only could give one simple instruction, it is, if you're going to have a carbohydrate, it's got to be attached to fiber. It has to, because you got to have competition for digestion. And I think of, I'm biased because I'm an author of liver books. So I think of the load that the liver takes when you have no competition for digestion and the role that the liver plays in that. So competition for digestion, if I was forced to just keep it in very simple terms, that's the way I would approach it. Don't have a carbohydrate that does not have fiber attached to it. And then we could go into the levels, whether you're low, very low, etc. And again, that it depends concept is really, it wouldn't be responsible for me to have a patient come in and I give every single person the same diet. All right. That wouldn't be something that I could do, that I would feel good about at the end of the day. So I guess that's why the it depends is so pervasive in some of the answers, because I see it in my own patients. But I'm looking for sustainability and competition for digestion.
Great answer. And Colette, same question to you.
Yeah, and it's a good question. And that is why that advice is everything in moderation is fine, because that covers all of the bases, and I can eat anything I want as long as I have it in moderation. But it doesn't work for a lot of people because carbohydrates are the reinforcing macronutrient, right? Protein is satiating, fat is satiating, it slows the emptying time of the digestion. Carbohydrates are reinforcing. When you have them, you want more for all the reasons that Kristin just described with the roller coaster ride of the blood sugar. So I call them the bully in the room because they will bully your metabolism, and your sense of moderation goes out the window because you will always want more. So if you're running 10 miles a day and you're lifting weights and you're not storing those carbohydrates as fat and you're choosing the healthiest, higher fiber carbohydrates, God bless you. But if you're sedentary and you're overweight and you're pre-diabetic, then you have to be conscious of that macronutrient and its intake and the impact on your health and your blood sugar.
Awesome. Great answer too. And I think the important part of all of this is, now that we covered all 3 macronutrients, is understanding that there's different answers. Like, that's kind of the fun part about nutrition, or the least fun part, depending on who you ask. I personally love it. It changes every day, but it gives you an understanding. And we talked intensively on this show a lot about fiber. So, Kristin, I'm glad you brought that up. Personally speaking, I tell all my clients the same joke. If you want to go eat an unlimited amount of sugar, I give you full permission as long as you get it from its natural source. And they go, well, what does that mean? I said, go pick sugarcane and eat it. Mm-hmm. And they go, well, what does sugarcane look like? I'm like, it's a bark. You want to go eat a bark and try digesting that bark? Good luck. The amount of insoluble fiber in there is through the roof. And that's why we don't eat it at its natural source, because it's really tough and gross.
Well, Anthony, if I could add to that, I just want to say, it's so interesting you said that. I'm half Dominican. I would spend my summers in Dominican Republic, and that's what we would have as a dessert. We would literally have sugarcane that we could go out to the field and cut. And the other thing that's different with it as well is the intensity of it. I mean, when you're like sucking on some sugarcane, the intensity of it is very different from what you might find in the Twizzlers is my great example again. So sorry to interrupt. The sugarcane really spoke to me because it's
I've never had anyone that's actually done it. So I'm kind of glad.
Yeah. I mean, Dominican Republic, you go there, it's just field and field of sugarcane.
No, great example. I'm going to get to 2 more final topics. The last one would be the controversial, and I'm going to use that broadly, is calories. So you hear all the time that people want to track the calories, calories in, calories out kind of phenomenon, to the point where even apps like MyFitnessPal, for example, will deduct calories based upon your activity. So the more you walk, the more calories it's going to get back to you, and you're going to really track and get down to the exact caloric intake of where you need to be. And in order to lose a pound of fat, you have to lose 500 calories a day, because that's going to equal 3,500 calories over a week, which is equivalent to a pound of fat. Then therefore you're going to lose. A lot of newer research coming out is showing that it doesn't really matter as far as tracking calories. While some people will fight to the bitter death that getting to a specific caloric number is important, and having a balance of all your macronutrients is important to hit that caloric intake. I will say just a little bit of a forewarning question, because I don't think either of you are going to bring this up. Eating under 1,200 calories a day is 100% not recommended ever. It is a sign of a more serious condition. So that's just my little disclaimer for that information. It is physically impossible to get enough micronutrients in eating under 1,200 calories. So ignoring that point, now that we got that out of the way, what do you guys think? And let's start with Colette. As far as calories in, calories out phenomenon, what are the guidelines on it? Rick, take it away.
Yeah, it's the theory of thermogenesis, and it's been around for 50 years or more, and people swear by it. But look where that's gotten us. Look at the health of the population and tell me, is that the be all and all? I mean, and either extreme, if you're not in the balance lane, either extreme, you're in the gutter. So too many carbohydrates, too many calories, too few calories will have health implications. You're shutting off your metabolism if you're at the under 1,200 calories a day, because the metabolism will slow down to adjust to the lack of calorie requirements. And if you're at the 3,000, 4,000, 5,000 calorie mark, then you're storing a lot of those calories as fat. So again, this is where balance comes in. It's so important. I don't particularly believe that it's the be all and end all of all theories. It's not a star player. It's a supporting actor. You have to consider calories to avoid the extremes and put them where you're meeting your calorie requirements without going too low or too high.
Awesome. Great answer. Thank you. And Kristin, same question to you.
Yeah, so in my industry as a dietitian, we used to have these really general handouts that were like 1,200, 1,500, 2,000. Then we'd figure out what we give to the patient as they walk out the door. And what those things didn't really look at was quality. It looked at quantity. So what I've noticed in my patients that have failed over and over and over again, and then come to me and say, I have failed over and over again. What am I doing wrong? They're focusing on that quantity and not the quality. And when you focus just on quantity, quality goes out the window. It's like, okay, I got to get 1,200 calories in, but I can't go 1 calorie over that. So as long as this works, that's going to go into it. So I do think, I don't think, to Colette's point too, I don't think it's a free for all. Especially if you look at like some ketogenic patterns. If we look at nutrigenomics, which is a totally different topic, but if we look at some of the genotyping, not everyone does well with a incredibly high fat diet and some of the calories that come along with that. So that could be more of on a genetic level. But I think quality is so important. When I think about how I communicate, when people ask me, people will say, what's your best tips for portion control? And my best tip is portion control doesn't work if you're eating the wrong things. So my best tip is eat until you're no longer hungry, not until you're full. It is what they do in the blue zones. That's the 80% fullness approach. And it's really hard to do. It's really hard to stop eating once something tastes good or there's other people at the table. There's all these factors that make us eat more and start ignoring leptin. Like, nah, I know leptin. You told me to stop eating, but I forget you for a night right now, right? So I think like if we're focusing on quantity, we will never be able to achieve that portion control type of perspective. Eating till you're no longer hungry, not until you're full. Because the hunger might continue to come because you're just looking at quantity and not quality, if that makes sense. So quality always has to trump that quantity.
I'm gonna do 2 follow-up points to this before we get to the last topic, because I think it's one for humor and one just more serious. So we'll start with the humor one. Do you believe that, minus all the pending not getting enough macronutrients, just specifically calories, if I ate 5,000 calories a day of lettuce, as an example, and that's all I ate was lettuce, would I gain weight? Yes or no? Colette?
No.
Kristin?
Yeah, I would say no as well.
Yeah, and I'm kind of in that same boat, and that's kind of my example of, well, it's not super important as far as people think, because if it were true that if I ate over my caloric intake, and then that means it doesn't matter what I'm eating, I'm going to gain weight if I eat 5,000 calories of anything, even if it's lettuce. So that's my humor question. My more serious part to it, which I want to bring in, is me personally. Somebody, and this is kind of a theory that, and I'm going to preface, this is totally a theory, nothing that's proven in science. So bear with us as we go through this. I believe that most individuals have higher metabolisms at younger ages, and we do things throughout our life that help effectively lower our metabolic rate. As an example, going on extreme low caloric diets. I think it was Kristin you mentioned before, or Colette, I'm sorry if I forgot who brought it up, but these low caloric diets are going to end up slowing down our metabolic rates because our body's thinking we're starving. And it's like, there's no food around, so I can't be burning that many calories a day at rest because I'm not going to eat. I don't know where my next fuel is going to come from. And we forget that now we have grocery stores. So our body's not caught up to that time yet where food is plentiful and we're not hunting for it. So it slows down. And then by the time we lose that 30 pounds, right, or whatever it is, we start eating again. And we're not only going to gain that 30 pounds back, we're going to gain back that 30 plus some. And this is what you see yo-yo dieting all the time. Now, my belief, which comes into this, is that doing things that intend boost your metabolic rate and avoiding those extreme diets. So if you take someone like me who's never been on an extreme diet in his life, that I can eat at a higher caloric intake constantly because I've never done anything to damage my metabolic rate, but instead I've constantly worked on building lean muscle mass to actually catch up and reinvigorate my metabolism. As an example, I don't track, but when I used to, I would eat between 4,000 and 5,000 calories a day. So using that as a brief, Kristin, I'm going to start with you. What do you think there's any facts to any of that, or you think this is all just theory and genetics?
There's a lot of genetics. I think there's a lot of genetics for sure. And let me just say, you would never have 5,000 calories of lettuce because the fiber would stop you before you even got there. Your stomach would be so distended, you would be running to the bathroom. And that's what I always say, like, if you sat at that movie theater, instead of having the Twizzlers, you had the broccoli, you'd never make it to the amount of calories that provided to you. So I think there's that perspective, but I think there's a lot of genetics that we know kind of go into this equation and everything we're talking about in the calories and things like that. But I think, at the end of the day, we are, as a population, overfueling. Right. So let's not look at that as calories, but let's look at the fact that we are overfueling. We are going beyond what our body is telling us we actually need. From a metabolism standpoint, I did a Today Show segment, I think it was last year, based on a study that was done at Duke saying that our metabolism doesn't change. We're all wrong. And this was a really rigorous study from a really respected researcher saying that, hey, between the ages of, let's say, I think it was 26 to like 65, there was no change in metabolism. But I think that I agree with you, Anthony. There's other things that you can look at: your muscle mass, your gender, even your sleep and your stress management and what's going on. Like I refer to the body as a vessel. And you kind of brought this up when you were talking about the fact that the body's not aware that there's grocery stores, right? The vessel is out for survival, and that's it. That's it, right? And the vessel's not aware that you live 5 minutes from fast food. So from that perspective, I think from the metabolism perspective, yes, we have yo-yo dieting. And when we have yo-yo dieting, it's possible your metabolism goes down because of adaptive thermogenesis, right? This concept that the body is like, well, this person went starving before, I got to prepare for this person to go starving again. I got to build up for that. But again, if we take a more simplistic approach, I'm going back to that simplicity, just really eating a nutrient dense diet, getting some movement, maybe not, running a marathon, but just getting some movement. Things like that can really be effective in keeping your metabolism in a place that is comfortable to you. And that might look different at 50 than it did when it was 18. And part of that is also looking at the realism. Again, I always go back to my patients and what my patients have said. I've had 55 plus women come in and say, I want my body I had at 17. And it probably won't happen because of a lot of different factors, right? But we can get to health. So I think that's kind of like the bottom line that I want to get to today is that if we get to health and take all of the noise of everything away, what does that look like? Like, how do we get to health? How do we get to longevity? How do we live longer and live better? And that's really kind of where you can structure what kind of dietary pattern you're going to look at.
Great. And I just kind of want to add that I think 99% of the population would agree. I'd rather live a couple less years, but be able to move and run around than live longer and be stuck in bed on 500 million meds just to be like,
absolutely.
I think we can all kind of agree on that. But Colette, go ahead. Same question to you.
Yeah, it's interesting. As a species, as a human species, the reason why we've survived longer than any other species is because of that particular adaptation that we have. when calories is sparse, everything slows down. So it's a good thing for the survival of the human race, but it's a bad thing as you age by starving yourself like that, slowing down your metabolism. You're not able to meet your calorie requirements when the time comes that you need those calories, because now your metabolism is slower, so you're more likely to store the excess calories as fat. So there's a good side and a bad side to that. I mean, it helps survival of the human race, and that's how the body adapts to a lack of calories. But at the same time, if it's chronic, it'll have long-term consequences on your overall metabolism.
Yeah, and I purposely set up the last question. So the setup to the last question is really, okay, we've dove a lot. We're over an hour already on the nutrition component of it. But now we're going to get into my wheelhouse, which is the exercise component of it. And really where I think guidelines need to be set more than nutrition in and of itself. As you both have said repeatedly, like I brought up before, it always depends. Nutrition depends. Exercise does not depend in a certain level. And I'm going to brief up to an example, and then I'll get to you guys to add to it. A recent study came out a couple months ago. At this point, it is probably about 6 months when this episode comes out, that if you were to pick between an exercise program and nutrition program for weight loss, the common belief has always been nutrition. You always hear the saying in the gym, abs are made in the kitchen. To an extent, it's true. But this study actually said the exact opposite. It said that if you were to look at both and you were to pick one or the other, it's actually way more important to set somebody up on an exercise regimen than it is a nutrition, if you had to pick. I personally believe, as I'm sure you guys do, you need both. But this is pretty interesting idea now that we're starting to move into this more of a movement pattern, right? So I did an episode on steps, how many steps to take in a day. And everything has shown the same thing. Yeah, all movement's better than none movement, but if you want ideal for weight loss, it's not 10,000 steps in a day. That's a totally a random number somebody came up with. It's actually 15,000 steps in a day. How many people do you know that get 15,000 steps in a day? Almost zero. So we're just, as a species, moving a lot less. I was watching the Romans, a documentary on the Romans, and they were talking about how they marched all the way to the Middle East and into Egypt. I want people to realize how far that is. You're saying thousands of people in gear that must have weighed 100 pounds that they were wearing marched in unison, which is harder, to Egypt. Crazy. So they were walking 15,000 steps a day. Our bodies are used to moving at long distances and constantly getting up short spurts of anaerobic, because of course sprinting is an anaerobic activity, to go get the food that we need. So it really needs that high energy output. And the guidelines for exercise, I think, are absolutely trash and need to be revised. But I want your opinion specifically to talk a little bit more about, what do you think this is? Do you think this is where the guidelines need to be? If so, what should they be? And how do you feel about all the examples I just gave? Kristin, up to you.
So I think the guidelines, and correct me if I'm wrong, because this is your wheelhouse, Anthony, 150 minutes a week, correct? Isn't that the general guidelines?
Yeah.
And I agree with you. I think like 150 minutes a week. Now, I will say there's some patients that I say that to, and they're like, what? When am I going to do that? Right. And then other patients, like I'm married to an ultra trail runner. He's like, I don't even know how many minutes a week. Right. So I think from the perspective of the guidelines, I totally agree. I think we need to be engaging in movement. Let's use the word movement, at least an hour every day. And I know the argument that I get from patients is, well, great. Tell me where I'm going to find that hour. But we find that hour to sit around and watch TV or to surf on the net. So we can find the hour, maybe not every day, but most days we can find that hour. And then look at opportunities. Again, I try and go less hardcore because I'm dealing with a population that exercise is not always something that they're doing when they come to see me. So we have to start small. If you're taking your kid to a baseball practice and that kid is at a field, walk for an hour. Don't go run errands. even though the running errands means you're moving around, like walk for an hour around wherever that person is. We have the advice of take stairs, park further along from the store, things like that. But really, like, I think there is such an amazing, amazing benefit to simply walking. And for my patient base, right? And I'm not talking about my husband who's like, doing a 24-hour race up in the mountains. I'm talking about the average person that's seeing me and has not exercised in 10 years. Just start walking. I tell my patients be more vertical than horizontal, and that's the right step in the right direction.
Yeah, I love it. I want to clarify a point you kind of brought up there before we have you answer this question. Is I'm not talking about being in a gym. I'm talking about just movement in general, which I've talked extensively in every episode. And as an example for you guys, it's as simple as walking to your mailbox and back. Like you get 5 minutes if you're working home or remote, or you just need to get up and go get water, walk to the water cooler and back, if that's still a thing. But just simple things like that is what I'm alluding to. But Colette, go for it.
Okay, Anthony, I hate to throw a wet blanket on your theory, but
no, I love it. I
truly believe that you cannot outrun or outwalk a bad diet. When I was a vegetarian for 20 years of my life, I would have to literally run every morning at 4:30 in the morning before I had to go to work, 10 miles a day. And then on the weekends, I would do 15 just to burn off all that high carbohydrate blood sugar. And they were healthy carbs. It was a vegetarian, healthy diet, but it didn't meet my needs as far as what my protein requirements were, what my calorie requirements were, with so many things. It just wasn't the right diet for me. But I tried it for philosophical reasons because I didn't want to kill animals. And at the end of that, even though I was running 10 miles a day, I had severe hypoglycemia because that constant intake of high carbohydrate foods from a vegetarian diet wore down my sugar metabolism. And there's diabetes in my family. I had the gene of diabetes. So I had to correct my diet, and I had to cut back on my exercise because there's a certain bell curve to exercise. At certain levels, you're gaining health outcomes, but you stress it, and then it's a big stress on the body, and then you're on the other side of the bell curve, and it's having negative impact. So back to balance. I don't think you can separate only exercise without consciousness of a particular diet. And I really believe you can outrun a bad diet.
I want to point out a couple of things. First, I hate when people only agree with me, so I'm glad you don't. I like having different opinions because honestly, it shows how even people who are well versed in all of this still have different opinions because there's no base. This is all brand new science. Exercise science, nutrition science is relatively new. So it changes every single day. And it's not something one person could be more right than the other. There's just different opinions to how to approach it. But I will say this, cardiovascular activity in my quick tip little pamphlet we give people all the time burns lean muscle mass. If you're only doing any type of cardiovascular, especially on a vegetarian diet, you're not getting enough protein. And therefore, when you're running, you're actually burning through muscle stores as you're running, especially long distances, which will actually, in theory, lower your metabolic rate. So then you're going to gain weight back a lot quicker. So I'm not a full believer in the cardiovascular. If I want me to get even more specific, my exact theory is that out of everything, nutrition, cardio, and strength training, I would pick strength training 9 times out of 10 for individuals because there's so many more benefits that lie in the strength training realm that don't lie in the cardio realm. They're both necessary. Let me be very clear. It's not, I don't like extremism on anything. It just needs to be a balance of everything. But strength training, especially, and I hate this because I get this not every day, if you're over the age of 65, people tell me I'm too old to go to the gym. No, you're actually in the class that needs to be in the gym. Yeah. We want people 65, 75, 85, 90 years old because at that point, strength training is more than just about building muscle. You're going to build bone density. We're going to solve simple things like osteoporosis and osteopenia. Like, we need you here. We need you lifting weights. You're not going to be deadlifting 1,000 pounds. But let's work on functionality movements. Let's work on learning how to reach for the cabinet, learning how to get up off the floor. simple things that are going to help you a lot longer in life. But I do appreciate the difference of opinion. And I want to get to the wrap point, right? So we went through everything. We hit every single thing, and we've learned that this is way more complex than anyone's ever thought in their life. I think that's the general consensus of all of this, to come up with guidelines for all of America. So give me, if you were to say, hey, this is the guideline, this is it, and I want to keep it simple. I'm a big believer in the KISS method, so keep it simple, stupid. You have to give it out to every audience, uneducated, educated, hundreds of millions of Americans. Get your point across. Follow this, whether it's exercise or nutrition. Kristin, what is that guideline that you're putting out? Please just keep it short and sweet. Go for it.
Okay, so my guideline, and this is what I'm giving most patients, is a Mediterranean diet that's modified to a more moderate carbohydrate approach. So less than about 26% of calories, about 130 grams. That works for my population. So Mediterranean, so that high level, and then looking at where we can take down, the carbohydrates and still keep it very high quality in terms of the nutrient density.
Awesome. Colette, same question.
Yeah, I would go broader than only diet and say exercise is really important. Activity, whether it's lifting weights or some sort of activity, is important. Sleep is really important. And then diet is part of that trifecta of things that are really important, because sleep will control stress and will help control stress. Exercise will preserve lean mass and keep you healthy longer as you age. And diet, and I agree with Kristin. It's a Mediterranean personality with a lower carbohydrate bent.
Awesome. So I think those are great answers from both of you. I personally love the simplicity of it, so people could have a better understanding of it, because that's ultimately what we're looking for. So final question, easiest one of all, is Colette, let's start with you. Where can people find you, get a hold of you, and give us that stuff?
Oh, sure. There's a website, Atkins.com, ATKINS.com. Quest also has a website. And my book is The Atkins 100 Eating Solution, or Eat Right, Not Less.
Awesome. Thank you. And Kristin, same question.
So my social handles are all the same. Fuel Well with Chrissy, as a play on feel well. I think happiness is a component that we didn't talk about yet.
That's
But
right.
if you're doing a diet and you're like, wow, I feel like I'm eating cardboard, that's not the right diet. You have to be happy as well. So Fuel Well with Chrissy, and then my book is Skinny Liver, and then my one coming out in the fall is called Regenerative Health.
Awesome. Thank you, Colette. Thank you, Kristin, for coming on. And thank you guys for joining us on this week's episode of Health and Fitness Redefined. Don't forget, hit that subscribe button and join us next week as we dive deeper into this really ever-changing field. And remember, fitness is medicine. Until next time.